Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Player Welfare. I'm Paul, the guy behind DrivingMaul, and thank you for joining me. Please feel free to put any comments below. I'm always up for a good old chat about rugby. So there have been a few things around player welfare this week. We've had a couple of players have to retire due to injury early. One of those including a concussion that he's taken 18 months to try and get over down here in New Zealand. Another one for a knee injury. On the concussion side of things, we had Dr. Willie Stewart come out and say that the concussion protocols are not fit for purpose. He had two real complaints to talk about. One is that whilst referees in the Northern Hemisphere initially started giving out a lot of cards for the contact with the head, he believed that they had eased off and returned back to normal, and that there weren't as many cards being handed out. That's something that we can't say in Super Rugby though. It looks like we're going to hit the same number of cards as we got in all of last season by about round 13 this time around, and we've already had as many red cards this season as we had all of last season. So there are definitely more cards being given out, and I have written a piece that I don't think yet has been published on Union Live app looking at whether cards are killing the game or not. Maybe that's something I'll talk about next week. He also had a go at the reviews where people have, where clubs have not followed the process, or where the players come back on concussed when he hasn't. I think Murray was one of them. Saints at Munster, Saints were another place, one that was reviewed as well, and that no punishments had been handed out, and that whereas clearly, whereas in his opinion, the process hadn't been followed and there should have been more sanction. So there's that side on the concussion piece, and also on another one we have had I've gone blank as to who it was. Sorry, Paul Thorburn. There we go. Came out and said that the game was basically too dangerous now to play, and that there were a number of things that he would remove to get the game back to being playable. So let's actually run through those and see the points he's making as to see whether they should be, well, whether he has valid points or not, or whether it's just a one of those clickbait sort of titles, or titles that get you into it. The first one that he was suggesting was the scrapping of mass substitutions. Now this is something that, and his point is that fit players coming on against tired players means the tired players are more likely to get hurt. Now this is something that I agree with, that we should reduce the number of substitutes, but I've been looking at it from a different point of view, which was, if you have more tired players out there, you're going to have more space on the pitch and encourage make it more of an attacking rather than a defensive game. So, but I do see his point as well, in that fit players against tired players can lead to injuries. Also, if we're talking about lower levels, having to get 23 players available every weekend, it can be harder, which may be one of the reasons why we are seeing less teams at club level, is that they're just having to get more players per team, and that's getting harder and harder to do. So I do think that we could be looking at a stage where we should be looking at maybe reducing the number of substitutes that we allow for a couple of reasons there. Also, I also do wonder whether we're getting to the stage where we need to have a separate set of rules for the professional game and the amateur game, because the professional players have so much time now to spend on strength and conditioning, that the two games are very different nowadays. So do we need to perhaps look at some of the changes in having rules at different levels? I'm not sure about that one. So the first one was mass substitutions, and I think I agree with him there. An end to the ludicrously dangerous practice of lifting at lineouts. Now this is something that we used to not be allowed, and you weren't allowed to lift, and then you weren't allowed to support, then you were allowed to support but not lift, and now obviously they've just let it be a free for all. And part of this is, if you have someone jumping up and as they're coming down, at what point are they being sort of contacted or lifted or supported, it becomes very hard to tell. And then the difference between supporting and lifting, again, is another one that becomes very difficult to tell. So on both of those, I can understand why it has moved to where it is. But when you have a player who is over 6 foot tall and being lifted by two people who are 6 foot tall themselves, and suddenly you have players who are someone's player's head who's 12 to 13 foot in the air. If he comes down, that clearly it can be a dangerous situation, and it is more a matter of when, not if, they're going to land badly and get hurt. But I really don't see how to legislate against this one, and I can see why the laws have moved to where they are. His third point, and there are just 4 to go through, by the way, was referees to consistently penalise crooked scrum feeds. And this is one that I think we've all been talking about since day dot. That we shouldn't allow the feed should go straight, and with 2 assistant referees, a referee, and a TMO, how that can't be seen it just confuses everybody who isn't a referee and hasn't been in that situation. Nigel Owens does say there's just a lot of things to be paying attention to at scrum time, and that's why it gets missed. And he says, yes, watching on TV, he can see the frustration of fans as well. So I think that is also one that we should tighten up, and it's one that we sort of see occasionally. It does get tightened up by referees for a week or two, and then it's back to the normal feeds that we get now. The last one then is more to be done to encourage forwards to commit to rucks and so prevent virtually the entire teams fanning out in a defensive line. And I'm not sure how or how he thinks that might happen, but there is definitely a prevalence over the last couple of years for defences to have changed to not commit players to the ruck and to have this long line. And so what you end up doing is having players just having to bash into each other and bash through a line because there are very few, if any, gaps anywhere, which clearly also can lead to obviously bigger collisions, bigger players being selected, and more injuries as well. So whilst I see his point there, I'm not sure how you can do that, and we've seen that where if you make it too much of a contest where the defence gets the upper hand, the attack just doesn't want the ball, and we end up with them just kicking, and it ended up being a kicking ping pong battle until someone makes a mistake, which is what we saw back in the World Cup when it was back in France a few years ago as well. So whilst there are some valid points here, I do think that some of them aren't fully thought through, but I do think that we could look at reducing the number of substitutes that are allowed for a couple of reasons. One, to create more space, and two, hopefully to not have fresh players bashing into fresh players. Also, what it would mean is that it would depower the scrum as well if you reduce the number of substitutes you allowed in the front row, because then the players would have to play the full 80 minutes, whereas now they're training with an expectation of only playing 60 minutes, not the full 80. And so they can be bigger players. So that would also help in that part of it as well. So those are the points that he brought up. Some of them are interesting. We do also need to keep an eye on concussion and make sure that these new rules about tackling to the head are refereed evenly on in both hemispheres. We don't want to end up with what we've had in the past, where rules are refereed differently in the two different hemispheres, and it becomes a bit of an issue when we have the internationals between them. Thank you very much for listening. As I say, I think cards are going to be a topic for next week, and enjoy whatever you're watching this weekend. Please do sign up for my newsletter, link above in Twitter or in the notes below if you're on YouTube. Share this with your friends and give it the old thumbs up on YouTube as well. Thank you for your time, and catch you all next time.